Hello and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology at Glen Oaks Community College. I'm Dr. Ren Hartung. For this video, I want to prepare at least my students for doing the Electromyography Lab. It's a muscle physiology lab where we put electrodes across a muscle or a group of muscles, and then we have those muscles perform different strengths of contraction and then see what kind of electrical activity is generated by those muscles. The present theory of motor unit recruitment related to EMG is basically that if the muscle is required to apply more force, a greater force of contraction, then we will see more electrical activity in that muscle using the EMG. EMG stands for electromyography, and again, it is a way of measuring the electrical activity that a muscle or a group of muscles is producing while those muscles or that muscle is doing the work that it's doing. The background for this, the things I like my students to know as background for this, the first one is what are membrane potentials? Very basically, what are membrane potentials? So I'm going to draw a cell. I'm just going to pretend this is a muscle cell, a skeletal muscle cell. And I'm just going to put the nucleus. I'm not going to try to put in all the striations and everything, but that tube represents part of a muscle cell. In terms of what membrane potentials are, it's basically this. The cell membrane has a charge. It's negative on the inside and it's positive on the outside. If this muscle cell is not being stimulated, that charge remains like that. The next concept to get, once you understand that there is a charge across the cell membrane of a muscle cell, the next concept to get is action potential. This electrical potential can be changed. This electrical charge, this electrical potential can be changed. When the muscle cell is stimulated to contract, this is what that change kind of looks like. The charge flips. It was negative on the inside, now it's positive on the inside of the cell. So the charge has flipped, and that will be the trigger to cause this cell to contract, by the way. But right after it's stimulated, right after the charge changes, it changes right back again. Almost immediately the charge will flip back again. So that's action potential. Again, action potential is where the charge of the cell membrane flips, and then almost immediately that charge flips right back again to that resting potential. We can also represent resting potential and action potential graphically on a graph. Along the x-axis would be time, and then along the y-axis would be millivolts or voltage, charge. And if we were measuring across this cell or across an entire muscle, if the cell is completely at rest, then we would see this lower charge, the negative charge on the inside of the cell. If an action potential occurred, then we'd see a spike and another spike. That's another action potential, another action potential. Each time the cell is signaled to contract, we'd see this charge change. Notice that means that there's a relationship between a charge change on a single cell's membrane and the physical activity of that cell, because every time this charge changes, that cell is going to contract. And if the charge changes over and over and over and over and over again, that means the cell is continuously being stimulated to contract. It will continue contracting. So that's probably even a little deeper than you need to know in terms of what is membrane potential and what are action potentials. Okay, the next, I'll leave that cell there because I'm going to draw a few more of them. I might make this cell smaller. The next major subject to understand is what's known as what is a motor unit. And then we're going to connect that up to motor unit recruitment. So we've got one skeletal muscle cell here, and of course within a given muscle, there are thousands or millions of these skeletal muscle cells or muscle fibers. Let me represent a few more cells here. So there's one more muscle cell. I guess I'll put another one down here. And then I'm going to start trying to represent the nervous system. I'm going to try to draw a little spinal cord over here. Sorry, I think my marker is losing a little bit of ink. So this is the gray matter in the spinal cord. The gray matter inside of the spinal cord kind of shows up looking almost like a butterfly, kind of a weird butterfly. Out here would be the white matter around the outside of the spinal cord. I didn't leave myself enough room for the whole spinal cord. Doesn't matter. And then here's the central canal. As you know, the spinal cord is part of the nervous system. The nervous system is made up of lots and lots of neurons and supporting cells. Let me draw one of those neurons. This is a motor neuron. Specifically, it's a lower motor neuron, by the way. Its cell body is in the gray matter of the spinal cord, and its axon is coming out. And this motor neuron's axon is going to make a connection with this muscle cell. And then this other muscle cell that I drew over here. And then it's going to make a connection to this muscle cell. If this motor neuron is stimulated, it will send neuronal signals down this axon, and every one of these muscle cells that this neuron is connected to, every one of these muscle cells will be stimulated to contract. It'll undergo charge changes, and those muscle cells will shorten. This is one motor unit. Another way to describe a motor unit is a single motor neuron, and all of the muscle cells that that motor neuron innervates, that it connects to, that it's going to stimulate. So that's what a motor unit is. Very simply, again, a motor unit is a single motor neuron, and the muscle cells that that motor neuron will stimulate or is connected to, or to put it simply, that that motor neuron innervates. In this instance, by the way, as you can see, our motor unit is made up of this one motor neuron and then 3 skeletal muscle cells. In reality, inside of you, motor units are larger than that. They consist of a motor neuron and thousands of skeletal muscle fibers, often, sometimes hundreds of thousands. And by the way, the more coordinated the muscle needs to be, the smaller these motor units will be. So for example, the muscles that control your eye movements, because they have to be very coordinated so you can focus on things, right? Those little muscles that control your eye movements, they just have maybe 1,000 or so, or just a few muscle cells controlled by each motor unit. Whereas the big muscles, like your quadricep group muscles in your leg, or the latissimus dorsi on your back, you use it to do pull-ups, right? These muscles that are large, that don't need to be terribly coordinated, but that are part of doing just these big, brutal movements, they tend to have much larger motor units, hundreds of thousands of muscle fibers in a motor unit. What I was really trying to get at there is, this is showing you what a motor unit is, but in reality, motor units are larger than this, and some of them are really large. Okay, sorry. Let me do another motor unit here, and I'm going to use a green color just to make sure you can see that it's different. It's within the same muscle, though. So here's one green muscle cell. And here's another green muscle cell. And 2 is probably enough. And then just to complete it, here's a green motor neuron cell body in the gray matter. Here's the green axon coming out. And that axon is going to connect to this green muscle fiber, muscle cell, and then to this other green muscle fiber, muscle cell. Now I have, in my little imaginary muscle, I've made it more complicated. I now have two motor units. I have one motor unit represented by the black neuron and the black muscle cells, and there's three muscle cells that are part of that motor unit. And then I have the green motor unit with one green motor neuron and the two green muscle cells that are innervated by that neuron. And now I think we can talk about motor unit recruitment. And let me describe basically first what motor unit recruitment is really referring to, or the question that it's trying to answer. You know that if you go to pick something up with your hand, if that thing is relatively light, like this pair of goggles from the chem lab, that's a really light thing, and I don't need to use a lot of force to be able to lift this object, right? But if I want to lift something heavier, like my little coffee pot here, combined with that mask from the chem lab, now I need more force. This muscle is going to have to generate more force. And notice that I'm doing the exact same movement. It's a nice smooth movement, about the same rate of speed. I can decrease the weight and I can still do the same movement, but that muscle is now generating less force to do the same movement. So the question is, how is it that we can get this huge variation of force of contraction from one muscle? How does that work? And the answer is, we think, the answer is motor unit recruitment. And here's basically how it works with the fictitious muscle that I have set up here. If you look, I think you'll notice that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 different strengths of contraction that this simplistic muscle is capable of. Let me walk through those possible strengths of contraction. If neither of these motor neurons are triggered, if neither of them are stimulated, then I have 0 force of contraction. So no muscle cells are contracting. If I want just a little bit of force, I could just trigger the green motor neuron, and then only the green muscle cells will contract. There's only 2 of them, so I'm getting a little bit of force. So let's turn that motor neuron off. I could contract or stimulate this black motor neuron that I drew, and then I would have 3 muscle cells contracting, probably a little bit more force than the last strength of contraction. And then lastly, I could stimulate both of these motor neurons. And then I would have all of the muscle cells here contracting, and I would have the most force that this particular muscle can generate. So again, neither cell stimulating, and therefore no cells contracting. Only the green one stimulated, only green cells, only 2 cells contracting, a little bit of contraction. Only the black neuron, and therefore the black muscle cells contracting, a little bit more force of contraction because we have 3 muscle cells here instead of just 2. And then lastly, everybody contracting, all of the muscle cells contracting, both of the motor units stimulated, and therefore as much contraction as I can get. Of course, inside of your muscles, there's not just 2 motor units. The motor units vary in size, and there's thousands or millions of them, so we can get a huge variation in terms of force of contraction so that you're able to lift things that are light to things that are a little bit more heavy, to trying to find an object that's even larger in here, but I don't really find anything very exciting. I guess I could pick up these sticks. Now I've got even more force of contraction necessary, and this is thanks to motor unit recruitment. Now, how do we connect this to the electromyogram? If I had electrodes over this muscle, then I would expect to see a difference in the electrical activity generated if I were lifting a heavier object, and I would expect to see a different amount of electrical activity if I were lifting something that was much lighter. Hope that makes sense. That's what we're after. We're trying to figure out. We're trying to see. What I love is if students can really make the connection between the amount of electrical activity generated by a muscle compared to the amount of actual physical contraction force generated by that muscle. That's what this lab is really about, helping you understand and be able to put into your own words. Okay, I hope this helps you understand. Oh, we're not done actually. What does an EMG look like? I have another video which kind of goes through what EMG looks like, but let's diagram this a little bit. When you do the EMG in the lab, what you'll notice is if you have a muscle completely at rest, at least, you should see a certain amount of electrical activity coming across the line that's produced along the computer screen. Not much electrical activity represented here. If there's more electrical activity, you'll see that electrical activity as the line goes up and down. And then if there's even more electrical activity, you should see that. So not much electrical activity, more electrical activity, even more electrical activity. This is what we see on the computer screen when we do an EMG, an electromyogram. The other concept to understand is what is the absolute integral of the EMG. And at least in my classes, I don't require you to know this math, except to know that the neat thing about this math is it allows us to go from being able to visually say, okay, there's a little bit of electrical activity here, there's more electrical activity here, and there's even more electrical activity here. It allows you to apply numbers to these that you can then use to compare. So if I were to have the computer go at either end of each one of these lines and have it calculate for me the absolute integral of each one of these lines, I might come out with something like this, 0.367, 0.472, and then 0.532. Again, this is absolute Each one of these is absolute integral of the EMG. And notice that there's no units here. When this math is done, the units are removed. Less electrical activity, that number is lower. A little bit more electrical activity, that number is going up. Even more electrical activity, that number is going up. So that if we had graphs here where it might be difficult to see if there was a big difference in electrical activity, these numbers could help us parse that out. That's one of the ways that they're really useful. And that's really all you need to know about absolute integral of the EMG, at least for my lab. Somebody who knows a lot more about math could probably give more value to how the how the absolute integral is derived and give more value to its importance. But the importance for this lab is just to be able to compare the electrical activity of each one of these instances of muscle contraction. Okay, those are the major things that I hope you'll get under your belt mentally before coming in to do this lab. Any questions, please leave them in comments down below, and thank you for watching.